Buried deep in the Korean mountains, a rusted fighter jet is uncovered inside, a journal no one expected. It tells of a secret rescue, a pilot's last flight, and a mission that defied all odds. Why did Captain Davis vanish that day, and what really happened in those final moments? The wind moved gently through the trees along a quiet hillside in Korea. The sky was gray, low with clouds, and the air hung still, almost as if the land remembered. A small crew of workers had been clearing out thick brush near the old conflict zone, just a few miles south of the 38th parallel. It was a forgotten place, mostly untouched since the fighting had ended decades ago. But on this day something strange caught their eye, something dull and metallic beneath the dirt and moss. Slowly they cleared the soil away. Rusted metal curved out from the earth like the bones of something long gone. It was the wreck of a jet, twisted, broken, and almost consumed by time. The faded number on its tail was just barely visible. Nearby, tangled wires and cracked panels told the story of a violent crash. The name stenciled under the cockpit glass, nearly worn away, still managed to say enough. Captain William Davis. Inside the cockpit, wedged beneath the seat, a small leather-bound book had survived. Its cover was worn and soft with age. Pages stuck together, some writing had faded, but most of it remained. A journal, personal, on it. And through it, a story came alive again, one that had been buried not just by soil but by silence. It began in 1952, at an airbase in South Korea. The airfield buzzed with engines, trucks, and hurried footsteps, but Captain Will Davis moved through it all with a quiet calm. He was in his early 30s, tall, lean, with sharp eyes that had seen too much for his age. His reputation was well known. He didn't fly safe missions, and he didn't fly for recognition. He flew because others needed him to. And when no one else would take the risk, Will usually stepped forward. His bunk was modest, barely touched. A single photo of a woman and a child was taped to the inside of his locker. His boots sat neatly beside his bed, and his helmet rested on a folded flag. He was precise, focused, and somewhere behind his steady eyes was a weight he never spoke of, the kind that grew heavier with each mission. On the edge of the runway, Lieutenant Aaron Keller leaned against a fuel truck, watching Davis check over his plane. Keller was young, barely into his 20s, and still held on to the kind of hope that hadn't yet been shaped by loss. He admired Davis more than he let on, but there was something about the captain's silence that made him uneasy. Will never celebrated after a successful mission. He never cracked jokes or shared stories. He just returned, nodded once, and moved on. "You ever get tired of flying out there alone?" Keller had asked once, trying to sound casual. Will hadn't looked up from his checklist. "Not yet." Keller had chuckled nervously. "Well, maybe one day I'll be crazy enough to fly like you." Will finally looked at him, eyes steady. "It's not about crazy, it's about making sure someone else makes it home." It was late afternoon, when the radio crackled in the operations tent. The usual hum of chatter died quickly. The voice that came through was strained, breaking up under poor signal. It belonged to a sergeant leading a reconnaissance group near the region of Chawon, a stretch of mountainous terrain known for its danger. They were trapped, cut off, surrounded, low on supplies, and out of time. The room went quiet as the transmission ended, the map table lit up with markers. Officers leaned in, voices low and tense. The options were limited, and none of them were good. Will stood just outside the tent, arms crossed, listening without saying a word. Keller approached him, a question already forming on his lips. But Davis had already turned toward his aircraft, walking with that same steady stride. No orders had been given, no plan had been made, but something in his gut had already decided. Behind him, the sun dipped toward the horizon. The air cooled, and the silence over the 38th parallel deepened, waiting for what came next. The air inside the command tent was tense and heavy, thick with the smell of damp canvas and burning fuel. Maps lined the walls, dotted with pins and scribbled notes. In the center, under the sharp glare of a swinging lamp, the officer stood crowded around a large table. Captain Davis stood off to one side, arms folded, his jaw tight. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said enough. He was already committed. The area in question was the Chawon Corridor, a name whispered with a kind of quiet dread. Just miles from the heart of enemy territory, it was a stretch of jagged hills, deep forests, and narrow paths. American troops had fought hard there over the past year. Many had made it out. Too many hadn't. Now, somewhere along those sharp ridgelines, a small group of American soldiers was trapped. Their last message had confirmed they were low on food and surrounded. The weather was turning bad, and soon the fog would settle in. Roads were already washed out, and heavy rains had triggered landslides. A ground rescue would never reach them in time. The silence in the tent broke as Colonel Harding, a grizzled man with decades of service behind him, pointed to a narrow valley on the map. This is where they were last seen. They moved in after dark for a recon up, but something went wrong. No one knows what. They made contact again just once. 12 men holed up in a dry creek bed. No movement since. They're boxed in. Davis stepped closer, eyes scanning the terrain. The valley narrowed at the far end, a sharp bend where tree cover gave way to open rock. A dangerous place to hide, but it might have been their only option. Air support, someone asked. Cloud cover's too low, Harding answered. Too dangerous for standard flyovers. Visibility's near zero and falling fast. A pause followed, then a voice from the back spoke up quietly. What about a drop? The room turned to Davis. His tone was calm, controlled, but the weight in his voice cut through the noise. We fly in low, real low. Drop supplies, give them a shot at holding out a little longer. Harding frowned. That's not a good plan, Will. That's a suicide run. Then, we make it better, Davis said. What if it's not just a drop? What if I land? The room fell into stunned silence. A landing, in enemy territory, in weather like this. No way, one of the younger officers muttered. Not with those trees. Not with that terrain. Davis looked down at the map, then slowly back up at the colonel. There's a stretch here, he pointed. Flat enough. If I lighten the load, strip the jet, I can get it down. Pick up who I can. Harding stared at him, trying to read the man behind the calm eyes. Will Davis had pulled off risky flights before. He was the kind of pilot who walked the edge with purpose. But this was something else. Even if you land, how do you plan to take off again? Davis didn't flinch. I don't. Not unless something changes. The colonel's eyes narrowed. He knew that tone, that quiet finality. A long pause followed. Then Harding looked around the room. No one else stepped forward. No one else even breathed. He finally nodded, slow and reluctant. You have one night to prepare. You leave at first light. Outside the tent, the base had gone quiet. The storm had settled in fully now. Rain came down in long sheets, tapping against the metal roofs. Davis walked toward the hangars alone, the path lit only by the glow of lamps and the distant flicker of lightning. Inside the mechanic's shed, Jun Soo worked beneath a canvas tarp, surrounded by scattered tools and open panels. He was a local mechanic who had been with the Americans since the early days of the conflict. He didn't wear a uniform, but everyone trusted him. He spoke little English, but what he said always mattered. When Davis walked in, Jun Soo looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. He could see it in Davis's face, the weight of what he was about to attempt. You fly tomorrow? He asked simply. Davis nodded. In the valley, need to be light, quiet, fast. Jun Soo tilted his head thoughtfully. He walked over to a small crate in the corner and pulled back the cover. Inside were scattered pieces of enemy aircraft panels, markings, parts stripped from wrecks and abandoned machines. You use this, he said. Paint gear. Make your plane not look like yours. Davis hesitated. You mean disguise it? Jun Soo nodded. Maybe it helps. Maybe it fools someone. Maybe it buys time. Davis looked down at the pieces. Red stars, worn and faded. The idea was bold, dangerous, but it might just give him an edge. Just enough confusion in the enemy's eyes to slip past the first glance. He looked back at Jun Soo. You sure this'll work? The mechanic shrugged lightly. Not sure, but better than nothing. For the next several hours they worked together. Panels were swapped. Paint was brushed on under flickering lights. Extra weight was pulled from the jet, non-essentials removed. Every ounce counted, every decision mattered. Back in his quarters, Davis opened the small journal on his desk, the same one that would be found decades later. He flipped through its pages, mostly blank. Then, finally he wrote, If you find this, it means I didn't make it back. But maybe they did. That's what matters. He closed the book gently and placed it inside a pouch sewn into the lining of his flight suit. Outside, the rain eased for just a moment, as if the storm itself was holding its breath. And in the soft quiet of that night, Captain Will Davis prepared for what many would call an impossible mission. But for him, it was never about the odds. It was about giving others a chance, no matter the cost. The hangar was nearly silent except for the soft clicking of tools and the low hum of a work lamp swinging from its cable. The storm outside had settled into a steady drizzle, casting a dim reflection across the smooth metal skin of the jet. Captain Will Davis stood beside it, sleeves rolled up, hands smudged with grease and black paint. He wasn't used to doing this kind of work himself, but tonight was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was personal. He moved carefully, tracing over the star insignia on the wing with a faded red stencil. It was a shape he'd seen 100 times on aircraft that once chased him through the clouds. Now, he was painting it onto his own jet. Jun-Soo watched silently from across the hangar, arms crossed, worry drawn across his face. "This is dangerous," the mechanic said quietly. "If they see you like this, even from far away, you won't have a chance." Will didn't look up. "They won't see me if I'm fast enough." Jun-Soo shook his head. "It's not just speed, it's luck, and skies are thin on luck these days." Will gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He finished the last coat and stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. The jet now looked like it belonged on the other side of the line. Not perfect, but enough to fool someone at a glance. Maybe just long enough. Later that night, the small base was quiet. Most had turned in early, trying to catch what rest they could between alarms. Will walked through the narrow paths between tents, his boots crunching on wet gravel. He stopped in front of a small wooden cabin, the one assigned to Lieutenant Aaron Keller. Inside, Keller sat at a desk, his flight helmet beside him, flipping through an old pocket guide someone back home had mailed him. Will knocked lightly and stepped in without waiting for an answer. "I need you to do something for me," Will said, handing over a folded envelope. Keller stood up slowly, taking it with both hands. His expression tightened as he glanced at the handwriting on the front. "For Laura?" he asked. Will nodded. Keller hesitated. Should I give this to her if something—" "Yes," Will said quietly, cutting him off. The silence that followed hung heavy between them. Neither man knew what to say. Not really. They had flown together for months, shared more skies than they could count, but never really talked about the possibility of not coming back. Until now. Keller looked at his captain, still trying to find the right words. "You sure you want to do this?" "No," Will said, "but I have to." Keller nodded, swallowing hard. "You shouldn't go alone." "I'm not," Will answered. "They'll be with me. Every one of them out there waiting." The two men stood in that small room, the weight of what lay ahead pressing in. Then Will clapped him gently on the shoulder and turned to leave. Outside, the sky had started to clear, just faint stars now, peeking through the retreating clouds. Will walked through the base slowly, passing the mess hall, the barracks, the old field radio tent. Here and there, a few soldiers lingered, playing cards or staring at their boots. A couple nodded as he passed. They didn't ask where he was going. They didn't need to. In the corner of the motor pool he found Sergeant Hughes, an old friend from his early days. The two shared a quiet moment, leaning against a truck without speaking. Eventually Hughes offered a cigarette, which Will declined. Instead he watched the smoke rise into the night, the only sign that time was still moving. Down near the airstrip the tower light blinked slowly, casting long shadows over the tarmac. Jun-Soo was there, standing near the jet, checking over the last details. Will approached, his steps slow, deliberate. "She's ready," Jun-Soo said, not turning around. "Fuel full. Load light. If you're going, now's the time." Will nodded but didn't climb in. He looked out across the dark field, lost in thought. Jun-Soo glanced at him. "You have a family?" Will nodded again. "Wife, back in Idaho." "You write her?" "I did." Jun-Soo took a long breath and said, "If anything goes wrong, they won't come for you." Will didn't respond. He didn't need to. That truth had been settled in his mind long ago. Sometimes, Jun-Soo added, being brave means knowing no one will follow. Will finally looked at him, his voice low. "They're counting on someone. Might as well be me." They stood there for a while, watching the stars grow brighter above them. The wind had calmed, but the air still felt heavy, like the sky itself was waiting for something to happen. Back in his bunk, Will packed light, just the essentials. He slipped the journal into his flight jacket again, the same one that would later be found in the wreckage. Pages slightly worn, ink faded but still legible. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, hands resting on his knees. The room around him was quiet. Still, he thought of Laura, Her laugh, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she always knew when he was lying, even about small things. He thought about the men out there in the valley, probably cold, probably tired, maybe thinking no one was coming. He stood up and zipped his jacket. Tomorrow they would know someone had. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the stars above him seemed to shine just a little brighter. Or maybe it was just the clarity that comes when a man finally understands what he's meant to do. And though no one said goodbye, though no formal words were exchanged, the quiet nods, the shared glances, and the long silences were enough. Everyone who needed to know already did. Dawn broke quietly over the Korean peninsula, but it brought no comfort. The sky was a dull gray, wrapped in thick fog that clung to the mountain peaks like a silent warning. At the far end of the runway the jet sat ready, painted to deceive, packed light, and holding more risk than fuel. Captain Will Davis climbed into the cockpit, just as the sky began to lighten. The air felt heavier than usual, as if it knew what was coming. He settled into his seat, strapped in, and flipped through the final checks with calm precision. Across the tarmac, Lieutenant Aaron Keller stood beside his own aircraft, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes fixed on his captain. No goodbyes were spoken, just a single nod shared between them, one of respect, of understanding, and of the kind of loyalty that needed no words. The engines roared to life. Moments later, both jets lifted from the wet tarmac and disappeared into the morning mist. The world above was cold and quiet, broken only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional burst of static over the radio. Below them stretched a maze of hills and valleys, terrain that had become a trap for the stranded soldiers somewhere near the Charwan corridor. Will kept his altitude low, flying just under the clouds. He didn't say much over the radio, neither did Keller. The silence between them was not discomfort, it was focus. Then, as they crossed into the corridor, the sky suddenly came alive. Flashes of fire erupted from the hillsides, bursts of smoke streaked upward, cutting through the mist like jagged bolts. Will pulled hard on the stick, dipping and weaving as the air turned hostile. He could hear Keller's voice crackle through the static. "They're locking on us, Captain," coming from both sides. Will didn't respond. He couldn't. His hands moved fast, eyes scanning left and right. A streak shot past the nose of his jet, close enough to rattle the frame. He dipped lower, barely above the ridge, hugging the terrain to stay beneath the line of fire. Then came the sound every pilot dreads, distant engines closing in fast. Will's eyes narrowed. "They're here," he said quietly. From the northeast, two shapes broke through the haze, sleek and fast, MiG-15s. Their silver bodies reflected the weak morning light, but there was nothing graceful about their approach. They moved like hunters, sharp, swift, and certain. One locked in behind Keller. Will reacted without thinking. He pulled sharply into a climb, drawing the attention of the second Moonlit. The sky spun around him as he twisted through a narrow cloud bank, then cut hard into a dive. The enemy jets followed, aggressive and relentless. What followed wasn't just a dogfight, it was a test of instinct. Will used every trick he knew. He darted between cloud layers, banked low along the side of a mountain, then soared back into the sky. Keller stayed close at first, but the fight was moving fast, too fast. "Keller, peel off, you hear me? Go back, now." There was a long pause on the radio. "I can stay." "No, that's an order." Another beat of silence. Then, reluctantly, Keller's voice came through. "Understood." Will could see his wingman break off, turning sharply and disappearing into the gray horizon. The MiG behind Keller gave brief chase, then turned its attention back to Will. Alone now, Will knew his odds had dropped even lower. He glanced down at the fuel gauge, already dipping lower than expected. That earlier engine hit had cost him more than he thought. The MiGs came back in fast, one on each side. Will banked hard, looping into the clouds again. It bought him a few seconds, just enough. He dove low, straight through a patch of trees that stood tall on a mountain ridge. One of the MiGs hesitated, the other followed too closely. A sharp twist, a sudden drop, the sound of branches cracking beneath, and then silence. Will emerged from the other side of the ridge, the clouds swallowing him up. Behind him, no one followed. The sky was quiet again, though the engine groaned now, a tired sound, dragging with it a warning. He leveled out and checked his bearings. Below, the hills sloped toward the valley floor. Somewhere in those woods the stranded unit waited. Time was running out. His jet shuddered as he dropped lower, moving with caution now. Each adjustment was careful, each glance at the dashboard more urgent. The fuel gauge kept falling. The mist thickened again. Trees passed under his wings like ghosts in the fog. He scanned the ground, looking for a clearing, a place to drop supplies or maybe more if luck allowed. He glanced once more at the empty sky behind him, then to the seat beside him where Keller once flew. Now it was just him and the echo of static in his headset. "Hang on," he whispered to the ground below. "I'm coming." The jet coasted lower, wings slicing through the morning air like blades. Despite the engine damage, despite the fading fuel, Will kept going. The valley was coming into view now. Somewhere down there, behind trees and silence, were the men he had promised to reach. The weight of that promise pressed on him now more than ever. And still he flew on. The valley opened up like a secret hidden beneath the clouds, narrow, quiet, and framed by steep ridges. From above, it looked peaceful, almost untouched. But Captain Will Davis knew better. Peace was never silent in a place like this. He flew low, barely skimming the treetops. The damaged engine coughed behind him, its rhythm uneven. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty. He didn't have the luxury of circling for long. Then he saw them. A cluster of figures tucked deep in a shadowy ravine. No tents, no movement that could give them away. Just a few worn helmets and faint glints of metal, catching the sun through the brush. About a dozen soldiers crouched low, their faces turned skyward at the sound of his jet, eyes filled with disbelief, and something more. Hope. Will pulled back on the throttle gently, letting the jet drift. He couldn't risk another pass. Every second counted now. Scanning the terrain, he spotted it, a flat stretch of rice field, dry and narrow, bordered by a winding creek and tall grass. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He circled once, just enough to line up. Beyond the field, a thin column of smoke drifted upward from the tree line, signs of movement. Likely patrols, too close for comfort. "We'll shut down the engine early," cutting power completely. The silence that followed was unnerving. No roar, no hum, just the whistling wind, and the creak of metal as the jet glided down, ghost-like, through the fog. The landing was rough. The wheels bounced hard on the uneven earth. Mud sprayed in every direction. The aircraft lurched fishtailed and skidded sideways before finally coming to a stop near the far edge of the field, just yards from the water's edge. Inside the ravine, the soldiers froze. For a second, no one moved. It was impossible. An American jet had just landed right there in enemy territory, without warning. One man stood up slowly, eyes locked on the still cockpit. The others followed, disbelief etched on their faces. As Will pushed the canopy open and climbed down, boots crunching in the mud, the men emerged from the brush like shadows coming back to life. Sergeant Nathan Cole, their leader, approached first. His uniform was worn, and his expression carried the weight of too many days, without rest. But when he saw Davis, something in him cracked, not from fear, but recognition. "You," Cole said, his voice hoarse. "You're Davis?" Will nodded. "Looks like we meet again." Cole blinked hard, almost smiling. "You flew cover for us near the ridge 3 months ago. Never thought I'd see that pilot face to face, and sure as anything I didn't expect it here." The other soldiers gathered around now, still trying to understand what they were seeing. A jet, painted in unfamiliar colors, sitting quietly in a rice field, with its pilot standing in front of it like he'd just parked a truck. One of the younger soldiers whispered, "How did he even find us?" Will pointed toward the hill behind them. "You left a trail, smoke, footpaths, broken tree lines. You've been trying to stay hidden, but someone forgot the wind shifts in the morning." Cole let out a quiet breath. "We lost our last radio 2 days ago. Thought no one even knew we were still out here." "We did," Will replied. "Didn't think we could get you out. Turns out I don't mind doing what others think is impossible." The sound of distant shouting broke the moment. In the woods beyond the ridge, voices echoed, sharp and urgent. Will turned toward the trees, his eyes scanning the distance. "Patrols?" he asked. Cole nodded grimly. "They've been closing in the last 24 hours. We've been moving every few hours, but we're running out of places to go." Will motioned to the plane. "Well, now you've got a different option." There was a pause. The men looked at one another. A few glanced at the jet, their expressions unsure. "Captain," Cole said carefully, "you're talking about putting 12 grown men into a fighter jet that's limping and out of gas." Will looked back at the plane, then at the field. "Not all at once, but I've got enough weight cut from the frame to carry a few at a time. 2, maybe 3, depending on size. We'll take shifts, make quick runs to a safe drop point west of the line. I've got Keller circling back with another bird. We planned for this. It wasn't entirely true. There was no guarantee Keller had made it back, but Will knew. Hesitation was dangerous now. One of the soldiers stepped forward. But what if they reach us before we get out? Will looked at him directly. Then we move faster than they do. There was silence again. Not of doubt, but of quiet decision. Cole clapped a hand on Will's shoulder. You've got grit, Davis. I won't lie. I thought we were done for out here. But if you're crazy enough to land a jet in a rice field, I'm crazy enough to climb in and trust you. A few of the others laughed quietly. It was the first time they had in days. Will turned toward the plane. Get what gear you can carry. Nothing heavy. We move in 5. As the men began to prepare, Cole stayed beside him, his voice low. You really think we're making it out of this? Will looked up at the sky, then back at the woods. I didn't come here to watch the clock run out. If we keep moving, we've got a shot. Cole didn't ask anything else. He just nodded. Minutes later, the first group was ready. Will climbed back into the cockpit, watching as 2 of the soldiers scrambled into the rear compartment, cramped, loud, and far from comfortable, but it was air, and it was moving west. As the engine sputtered to life again, and the plane began its rough roll back across the field, Will looked once more at the horizon. The patrols were close now. The hills held shadows that moved, but the sound of the engine rose louder, and the jet lifted. Just barely, but it flew. Behind him, the rest of the soldiers watched as the aircraft disappeared into the gray morning sky, and for the first time in days, they believed again. Captain Davis was not just flying them out. He was flying them home. The rice field, though quiet, was far from safe. The narrow ravine where the soldiers had sheltered all night echoed faint traces of footsteps and distant movement. Every man kept low, watching the tree lines with wary eyes. Captain Davis crouched beside Sergeant Cole, both of them staring at the grounded jet like it didn't belong on Earth. The men were in bad shape. Some limped, others barely stood. Their eyes told the story: days without proper food or rest, minds pushed past the edge. Walking out of this valley wasn't an option, and staying, even less so. Davis studied the terrain again. Then his eyes moved beyond the ridgeline, toward a distant smoke column. There's a village just north of here, he said quietly, more to himself than to Cole. If the reports were right, there were enemy vehicles stationed there before the last retreat. Maybe they left something behind. Cole raised a brow. You're thinking of driving out of here? Davis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out the small map tucked inside his jacket and unfolded it on the ground. If we can find just 2 working trucks, we could fit the entire group. Stay off the main roads, move at first light, and slip past the last checkpoint by mid-morning. And if the trucks are guarded? Cole asked. Davis met his gaze. Then we find another way. But we can't stay here waiting for the sky to clear or hope someone else comes. Cole nodded slowly, then stood and called the group in for a quiet briefing. The plan wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good. But it was a plan, and that alone gave the soldiers something they hadn't had in days: direction. Under cover of darkness, Davis and Cole moved with the practiced steps of men who had learned how to be invisible. The narrow path toward the village wound through brush and farmland. Every sound, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, felt louder than it should have. When the first rooftops came into view, they dropped to their knees. The village sat in a hollow, quiet, but not empty. Cooking fires glowed faintly behind shuttered windows. Dogs barked once, then stopped. The 2 men slid into the shadows behind an abandoned schoolhouse, where rusted farming tools leaned against a collapsed wall. That's when they saw them. 2 transport trucks, parked under a tattered canopy near the edge of the village. One had a flat tire, but the other looked usable. They crept closer, staying behind stacks of firewood and half-built carts. Then, movement. A pair of villagers stepped out of a doorway nearby, both wrapped in long coats. Their eyes met Davis's for a second, too long. No one spoke. The men turned and walked away, but not quickly. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. Cole whispered, "They saw us." "Yeah," Davis replied, "but they didn't raise the alarm." "Means they don't know who we are. Or maybe they do, and just don't care." They pushed forward. Davis climbed into the driver's seat of the first truck. The key wasn't in it, but he found it under the seat. He checked the fuel gauge, just enough to get out of the valley, maybe more. Cole moved to the second truck and repeated the process. That's when the sound of distant boots filled the air. A patrol, not large, maybe 3 or 4 men, talking softly in Korean as they walked around the perimeter of the village. Davis froze, listening. The footsteps were getting closer. He slid under the truck, pressing his back into the cold dirt. Cole joined him seconds later. The sound of boots on gravel echoed just a few yards away. Then silence. A match struck. One of the patrol members lit a cigarette, leaned against the canopy post just above Davis's head. For a long moment nothing moved. The scent of tobacco drifted downward. Davis held his breath. The man exhaled slowly, then said something in a relaxed voice, too relaxed for someone sensing danger. After another minute the patrol wandered off, their voices fading back into the night. Cole exhaled softly. That was close. They didn't speak again until both trucks were rolling quietly back toward the ravine. The tires hummed low against the dirt path. Davis took the lead, headlights off, guiding the second truck with hand signals through the side mirror. At the edge of the tray line, a sentry waved them in. The soldiers moved quickly, gathering what little gear they had. No cheers, no loud celebrations, just quiet nods and glances that carried the weight of trust. Davis climbed down and handed the first truck over to Cole. You drive this one, I'll follow. What if they come after us? Cole asked. Davis stared out at the darkness, then answered, then we'll be ready. By the time the sun began to touch the hills, the trucks were moving. Slow, cautious, but steady. The forest road ahead was uncertain, filled with turns, false trails, and the ever-present threat of being spotted. But for the first time in days, the group had wheels, a direction, and the steady confidence of a pilot who refused to leave anyone behind. And somewhere, just behind them, the quiet village remained still. No alarms, no warnings, just silence, like it had all been a shared secret. But the road ahead would not stay silent for long. The engines groaned low as the 2 trucks rolled over uneven dirt roads, their tires crunching softly against rocks and broken branches. The morning mist hadn't yet lifted, wrapping the hills in a thick, gray shroud that made the world ahead look like a faded map. Captain Davis sat at the wheel of the second truck, his eyes flicking between the winding path and the group ahead. Cole was driving the lead vehicle, constantly adjusting the pace to match the tight turns and sudden dips of the mountain road. In Davis's lap rested a worn paper map, edges curled from age and rain. It had been marked up the night before by Jun Soo, the Korean mechanic whose local knowledge had become the only compass they trusted. The main roads were off-limits, too exposed, too obvious. The only way out now was a collection of forgotten back roads, old farmer trails that twisted through valleys and snaked between outposts. They had started moving before dawn. The hope was to slip past the eyes watching the main passes and reach an American checkpoint by late afternoon. But with every mile, the silence around them felt less like safety and more like the quiet before a storm. At one turn Davis slowed down and leaned out his window. Up ahead, Cole had stopped. Davis stepped out and jogged to the front truck. Just beyond the next bend, lying half in a ditch, was the charred shell of an American tank. The turret was twisted. The tracks had been blown clean off. No signs of movement, no sound, just metal smoke and the heavy reminder that this path wasn't safe either. Fresh, Cole said, looking around. Maybe a day old, or less. Davis nodded slowly. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Every man who saw it understood what it meant. They were driving into a place that had just swallowed up a crew like theirs. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and the road behind them wasn't any kinder. Back in the air base miles away, the morning was filled with worry. Lieutenant Keller hadn't slept. Ever since Davis had disappeared into the mountains, he'd been pacing the flight line, watching the fog burn off and waiting for a sign, any sign that the mission had succeeded. But there was none. He stood near the radio room, arms crossed, jaw tight. The official word was simple: wait. Wait for contact. Wait for signal. But waiting wasn't in his nature. Davis had told him to go home, to return to base. He had obeyed, but his gut hadn't settled. By mid-morning he made up his mind. He signed out a fuel-checked Sabre, took off without fanfare, and headed straight for the valleys north of Charkan. He flew low, hugging the terrain, scanning for any sign of movement on the road. Back in the mountains, Davis kept driving, his grip tightening as the road narrowed between two rock faces. The engine groaned climbing a hill, and the truck bounced violently on a sharp dip. From the passenger seat, one of the rescued soldiers scanned the surroundings with binoculars. He'd been quiet most of the ride, but now he spoke. "Captain, I think I see wires up ahead, across the road." Davis slowed to a crawl. He stopped 20 feet before the wires. Stepping out, he motioned for Cole to halt behind him. A mine trap. Old, rusted wires connected to buried boxes just beyond the brush. Had they driven any faster, they wouldn't be standing now. Davis knelt, studied the setup. It wasn't fresh, but it was still dangerous. They spent the next hour clearing the path by hand. Every movement, careful, every breath measured. When they finally rolled forward again, the sun had climbed higher, and their delay had cost them precious time. Inside his cockpit, Keller scanned the valley below. The roads looked empty, until he saw a flash of movement near a bend. Two trucks, crawling through the hills like ants on a thread. His heart kicked. That had to be them. He banked wide and flew farther out, trying not to draw attention, but he wasn't the only one watching the roads. Davis reached for the portable radio he had tuned to scan local frequencies. A voice crackled through, sharp, clipped, not American. He froze, turning up the volume. Foreign radio chatter. Coordinated, descriptions matching their trucks. Someone had spotted them. "They know," he whispered. "Can." He leaned out his window and signaled Cole with a flashlight. "Change route." Cole blinked in reply, then veered off the next intersection toward an even narrower trail, one that wasn't on the original map. It was barely wide enough for the trucks to pass, but it led into thicker forest, and with it cover. Davis's mind raced. If the enemy had spotted them, it meant the village they passed through hadn't kept silent, or worse, they'd been followed. Either way, they were now in a race against time. He turned to the soldier riding next to him. "Tell the men in the back to stay low, and brace. We're going to take a hard route. If we can stay hidden until sundown, we might just have a chance." Overhead, Keller looped again, now flying higher to avoid detection. He switched to a short-range radio and called the base. "I've got them. They're moving northeast, through dense forest, possible tail on them." Static answered at first, then a voice replied with urgency. "Stay in the area. We're scrambling a search team." Keller looked down again. The trucks were now barely visible through the trees, winding toward what looked like another ridgeline. He stayed with them, watching, protecting, and below, Davis kept driving, aware now that every mile forward was a mile deeper into the unknown. The road ahead twisted like a question mark, and behind them the answer might be closing in fast. The road curved tightly through the mountain pass, boxed in by sheer cliffs and dense woods. The trucks crawled forward, their engines rumbling low under the weight of 12 exhausted men, and one pilot who hadn't rested in days. It felt too quiet. No wind, no bird, just the crunch of wheels on gravel. Will sat beside Sergeant Cole in the lead truck, fingers tapping nervously on the dash. June Sue's map had shown this route as a forgotten logging road, rarely patrolled, but instincts were whispering otherwise. Behind them, the second truck followed close, its headlights off to keep a low profile. Every man inside kept his hand near whatever weapon he could still carry. Most were too drained to speak. Eyes scanned the ridgelines. Faces stayed tight with unspoken fear. Then it happened. A single flare burst above the canyon, red and bright, then vanished. Silence. For a beat, then the cliffs lit up. From above, fire poured down. The rocks echoed with cracks and blasts, shaking dust loose from the overhangs. One of the rear tires burst. The second truck skidded sideways, sliding into a shallow ditch. Shouts rang out. Davis threw open his door and ducked behind the truck, shouting to the men to take cover. They had walked right into a trap. It had been waiting there all along, like a snare hidden beneath leaves. Cole tried to stand but stumbled, groaning. He'd taken a hit in the shoulder, not serious but enough to weaken him. Davis pulled him upright, looping an arm around his waist. "We don't leave anyone behind," Will muttered under his breath, half to Cole, half to himself. The others scattered into cover behind boulders and tree stumps, returning fire, but they were boxed in. Whoever had set this trap had planned it carefully. Enemy figures moved across the ridge, firing from angles that left little room to move forward or back. Pinned down and running out of time, Will looked to the sky. He reached for the flare gun still tucked under his coat, only one round left. He aimed straight up and fired. The flare arced high, glowing white against the smoky dawn, and then drifted slowly down like a falling star. Seconds later, the clouds split with the roar of a jet engine. Keller had returned. He dove from the sky like a hawk, low and fast, his jet slicing through the canyon as if skimming the treetops. The sudden blast of his flyby broke the rhythm of the ambush. Enemy fire wavered. Several scattered from the ridge, diving into cover of their own. Keller came around again. This time he dropped low and skimmed a rocky ledge where the ambushers had taken position. Dust and debris exploded upward. It wasn't a direct strike, but enough to break the trap wide open. Below, the convoy scrambled to regroup. Davis helped Cole into the truck, his body braced and straining under the weight of both man and urgency. The first truck, though battered, could still move. But the second, its rear axle had sunk into the ditch. The wheels spun helplessly in place. Davis turned to the others. "Get everyone in the first truck. Go." One of the privates looked back, panicked. "What about the second truck?" "I'll get it moving," Davis said, already sprinting toward it. He threw his shoulder into the back bumper. The tires dug deeper into the soil. Smoke rose from the engine. Every second felt like an hour. Enemy fire returned in bursts, now more cautious, but still coming. One round pinged off the metal just feet from where he stood. Davis pushed harder. The engine coughed. The tires turned. Then, with a loud groan and a jolt forward, the truck jerked free from the ditch. A cheer rose from the men nearby. But the path ahead wasn't clear yet. Keller, circling above, buzzed low once more, giving Davis just enough space to climb into the driver's seat and gun the engine. The two trucks lurched forward again, the narrow mountain road winding through the last stretch of danger. In the mirrors, Davis could still see shadows on the ridges, watching, waiting, but they didn't pursue, not with Keller still above. As the pass widened, the cliffs fell away behind them. Trees gave way to open land, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the path ahead held light. The men didn't speak, not yet. No one wanted to break the moment. But in the cab of the lead truck, Davis looked over at Cole, who stared out the window with tired eyes. "You still with me?" Davis asked. Cole nodded slowly. "You're out of your mind." Davis gave a quiet, worn smile. "Good, just making sure." They drove in silence for several more minutes, until the hills thinned into plains and the southern horizon began to show the shimmer of friendly movement. American tents, vehicles, signals, help. They were almost there, but Davis knew what was coming. His fuel was low, critically low, and his jet was still hidden behind a ridge, a few miles back. He had made peace with that long before the convoy even left the ravine. He glanced upward one last time. Keller's jet passed overhead again, banking gently in a circle, watching like a guardian from the clouds. And for now, they were safe. But deep in Davis's mind, a single thought stayed with him like a quiet drumbeat. The mission wasn't over yet, and he had one last thing left to do. The convoy rumbled on, dust trailing behind the wheels like a curtain closing on a stage. The hills behind them, once echoing with gunfire, grew quiet with distance. In the lead truck, Sergeant Cole leaned his head against the glass, fighting the weight of exhaustion and pain, while the others sat in silence, each lost in their own stunned thoughts. But Will Davis wasn't with them. The rice field where he had landed the jet wasn't far, maybe 2 miles back. Nestled in a hollow between tree lines, it was invisible from above, unless you knew exactly where to look. Davis hadn't said it out loud, but Keller and Cole had both seen it in his eyes. He never planned to ride back with them. As the last truck rolled out of sight, Davis sprinted through the trees alone, boots sinking into soft earth as he cut across the ridge. His chest burned with each breath, but he pushed harder. The roar of Keller's jet overhead was fading now, growing smaller with every pass. He needed to reach the aircraft fast. But as he crested the ridge, his heart dropped. The clearing was crawling with soldiers, a half dozen, maybe more. They stood around the camouflage jet, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the trees. Someone must have followed the tire tracks or spotted the flare from earlier. Either way, they had found it. He ducked low behind a fallen tree, mind racing. There was no way to reach the jet without being seen. He could slip away and disappear into the hills, but that would mean abandoning the aircraft, leaving it to be studied or worse used. No, that plane had to stay out of enemy hands. And if that meant one last move, so be it. Davis reached into his jacket, pulled out his sidearm, and checked it quickly. Then, he stepped up onto the edge of the hill and fired a single shot high into the air. The soldiers below froze. Then he fired again, and again, into the sky, into the trees. A shout went up. They turned, scrambling into motion, weapons raised, but Davis was already gone, ducking into the forest, moving fast and loud on purpose. The branches cracked under his boots. He let his jacket snag and tear against the underbrush, anything to pull them away. It worked. From the clearing, several soldiers broke off, running after the sound. Davis pushed deeper into the forest, circling wide, not toward safety but away from it, deeper into the hills. The gun in his hand was mostly a noisemaker now. He didn't expect to use it again. He just needed to vanish long enough for the trucks to clear the mountains, long enough for Keller to make it back. Minutes passed. The sounds behind him grew softer, distant shouts, then only the wind. At a high ridge, Davis stopped. From here, he could just barely see the tips of the forest canopy, where his jet still sat. It looked so small now, a machine built for speed, trapped in stillness. He thought about the day he first flew it, how proud he'd been, how loud the sky had felt back then. Now the sky was quiet. He looked up and smiled. Keller's jet passed overhead again, circling slow and low, like a hawk scanning the brush. He was looking for Davis, hoping maybe that he'd somehow made it to the aircraft, somehow lifted off. But the jet stayed grounded, and there was no figure waiting in the clearing. Keller pulled higher, and then the sound faded. By dusk, the trucks arrived at the edge of friendly territory. American soldiers rushed out to meet them. Medics pulled the wounded down carefully. Commanding officers stood stunned as they counted the survivors. Soldiers who had been listed as missing, presumed lost. They all asked the same thing. "How did you get out?" And each man gave the same answer. "Captain Davis." They waited for him to appear, kept glancing down the road, half expecting him to pull in behind them, with a tired smile and that worn-out flight jacket. But he didn't come. Hours passed, then the night. No radio contact, no jet on the runway. Just the memory of a man who had walked into the fire so others could walk out. Later, Keller would land and step out of the cockpit without a word. He handed off his helmet and walked straight past the others. No salute, no ceremony, just silence. Inside the barracks he found the letter, tucked inside his locker, where Davis had left it. Unsealed, addressed simply, Laura. He held it in his hands for a long time before sitting down and reading the first line. "If you're holding this, then I didn't make it back." The rest of the words blurred as he read them. The kind of letter no pilot ever wanted to write, and no friend ever wanted to deliver. But Davis had written it anyway. Because he had known. Because deep down, maybe he always had. And yet he still went. For the mission. For the men. For something bigger than himself. That night, the airbase was quiet. No one said much. But every man who had made it home carried the same weight in their eyes. The memory of a pilot who flew into danger, not to fight but to rescue. And in doing so, became something more than a soldier. He became a legend. The base was quiet when Keller opened the envelope. He sat alone in the dim barracks, boots dusty, uniform still damp from the flight. Outside, a cold wind rustled the flag, and somewhere down the hall, a radio murmured, with distant chatter. But inside that room, time had stopped. The paper was worn, folded with care. His name was written on the front in Davis's familiar script, steady, bold. He opened it slowly. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it back, and I need you to do something for me." Keller's eyes didn't leave the page. "Tell Laura I thought about her the whole way. From the moment I touched the throttle to the moment the sky disappeared. She was always the calm in my storm. I didn't say goodbye because I couldn't. You don't say goodbye to the parts of you that matter most." Keller swallowed hard. "And to you, Keller, don't carry this weight. I made my choice, same as every man out there who ever stepped onto a runway and knew the odds. I flew that mission because someone had to. Because if those soldiers made it home, it was worth it." The letter shook slightly in Keller's hands. "We don't get to choose how history remembers us, but we do get to choose how we show up when it counts. That's all duty really is, showing up for the ones who can't walk away." Outside, the sun had dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the runway. Keller folded the letter gently, as if sealing a promise. Years passed. The war ended. Soldiers came home. Some were met with cheers, others with silence. and for many the hardest part came after the quiet moments when the noise stopped and the memories stayed. But Davis remained, if not in body, then in the stories. The letter was passed on to Laura, his name was carved into a monument, and in quiet corners of air bases across the country, young pilots learned his story told in calm voices over black coffee and faded photographs. Then, one fall morning, decades later, a boy stood in a small museum in the hills of Virginia. He was no older than 15, a quiet kid, eyes sharp like his grandfather's. He ran his fingers gently over the cracked leather of an old flight jacket, now sealed in glass. Below it a display case held a weathered book, its cover worn soft, its pages yellowed with time. A journal. The tag read, "Recovered from the wreck of an F-86 Sabre, unearthed in the Charwan Valley, Korea, belonging to Captain William Davis." The boy looked up at his father, who nodded. "Go ahead," he said. Carefully the boy opened the cover. The handwriting inside was firm and neat. Names, coordinates, sketches of mountains, maps of escape routes, and ravines, notes on wind speeds, elevation, sunrise patterns. Each page told a story, not of battles but of decisions, of risks taken when no one was watching, of quiet leadership. Near the back in smaller handwriting, a final entry waited. If they made it home, it was worth it. The boy stared at the words. No medals, no speeches, just that. He didn't speak for a long time. Outside the museum, the wind stirred again. The flag danced softly in the breeze. Somewhere far off, a jet passed overhead, silent now, high above the clouds. In the stillness, Davis's words lived on, not just in paper or stone or display cases, but in the hearts of those who understood what it meant to stand up when it mattered most and to keep going, even when the sky grows dark, because some stories never fade. They're passed on, carried forward, lived again. If you're a proud American who honors the bravery and sacrifice of our war heroes, this channel is for you. Subscribe now and join us in keeping their powerful stories alive. Real heroes, real battles, and the legacy they left behind. Don't miss a single one.